Many people have asked how Meals on Wheels came into existence. It's an interesting story. I was interested in the care of the aged long before Meals on Wheels came onto the scene. But because of my interest in the care of the aged as a minister in the church, the National Council for the Care of the Aged, which had its headquarters in Cape Town, asked me to serve on their National Executive Committee. So in that way I became introduced to the needs of the aged on a national basis. On one executive meeting, the chairman of the council asked the executive committee what can be done in South Africa to meet feeding the aged who cannot care for themselves. Because at that time the idea was to keep the aged in their own homes as long as possible without getting them moved into institutions. So the feeding of the aged then was a very essentially component of the care of the aged on a social basis in South Africa. When he said that the aged should be cared for on a national basis, a few thoughts flashed through my mind. Number one, a national need beyond the need in the church. And I thought of the commandment which says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor. But I thought of your neighbor on a national basis and not on a local basis. Then secondly, it occurred to me that the welfare organization in the church, which was known as the Dorcas Society at that time, and I'm now speaking about 1963-64, was the correct infrastructure through which this service could begin and be developed on a national scale. Now, the idea of Meals on Wheels had lodged in my mind on a previous occasion when I had spoken to somebody about the war years in Britain, when sections of London were bombed out and people had to be supplied with meals because they had no homes, they had no facilities. And so a service was founded in Britain called Meals on Wheels. And I thought immediately, why can we not apply this system in South Africa? Now, other organizations at that time had thought of this as well, but their service was on a very small, localized basis. There were two organizations. But this called for Meals on Wheels for the care of the aged on a national basis. And so I thought to myself, or rather the Spirit of God induced the thinking in my mind. here's an opportunity, a gateway through which the church could be of national service in caring for people. I thought it was a very challenging idea, because I was president of the Cape Conference at the time, and very extensive, because this could become so large it could involve hundreds of caregivers. So as I thought about the matter, the Spirit of God says, now look, don't worry about how this is going to develop. I'm giving you a little plant. You take that plant and go and plant it in the church. And then very shortly after that, I was visiting East London on an official basis, and I was in the home of Pastor and Mrs. Gebhardt. He was the pastor of the East London church at the time. And he said to me, Pastor, don't you know of a project? Our ladies in the church are looking for a project that they could become involved with. So I said to him, Kwasi, I've got an idea. We called a meeting of the ladies, the Dorcas Society as it was known at that time, and they thought this was a very creative idea and they would like to become involved. So we discussed the matter with the church board, and they approved it. And then I called for the services of a friend of mine who was doing harvesting gathering in Cape Town with the name of Steve Smith. He was a great guy, a footballer, and a very proactive, outgoing person. So I called him to come to East London, and I said, Steve, we've got a project here, and I want you to become involved. I said, I want you to go to the businessmen of East London City and collect sufficient funds to buy a meals delivery vehicle. Immediately it clicked in his mind, and he says, I'll go. And within 1 week, he had raised sufficient money from the businessmen in East London to buy the first Meals on Wheels delivery van. We had it painted up, presented it to the church, and gave them a few guidelines and said, here it is, take it and go. The ladies enthusiastically organized themselves. Fortunately, they had a kitchen that they could cook in at the church, organized themselves, cooked the first meals, and delivered them to the aged in Duncanville in East London. From there on, the idea began to catch on, and the tree began to grow. Very soon, we had organizations going in Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and various places in the peninsula, including Belleville. Meals on Wheels. And that is how Meals on Wheels actually started in South Africa. It was almost a command on the part of the Spirit of God, you take this tree and go and plant it. I was merely the servant, merely the agent. And that is how Meals on Wheels started. Fortunately, God gave me a heart that cared. And I think I inherited this from my mother. And we found such a response to this offer of care, of feeding the aged, that we knew that from now on it was God's project. And that is how Meals on Wheels came into existence in 1964. From then on, it grew. And I think I will leave the Meals on Wheels organization to fill in the up-to-date details of how this organization has now developed to where at the present moment it is operating. At this particular point, I want to thank all the ladies, hundreds of them, for watering this plant, planting seeds all over the place, and getting the service going. And the church was actually now able to render a community service, becoming national. This was the second commandment: love your neighbor. From then on, as with everything else, there were problems and difficulties. Funds had to be raised, infrastructures had to be developed, and we had to depend on the local leadership in the various churches to do this. But obviously it became so big that we recognized that there had to be an infrastructure that would take care of some of these needs to a certain extent. And one of the most important needs at that time was to keep Meals on Wheels a spiritual service. Because the raising of funds could be overwhelming. And the spiritual aspect of Meals on Wheels could be forgotten. Now that was a danger. And balance had to be brought into the organization to keep, number one, the churches involved. Number two, it becoming secular, simply because we were dealing with a secular society. In the organization of Meals on Wheels, it was very important to understand that when the meals were delivered to the aged, wherever they were, the meals had to be nutritionally balanced and had to be warm. So that was quite a challenge to work out. But the service has worked that out splendidly, and wherever meals are delivered today, or received or eaten by people, they're getting a balanced meal and warm and nutritious. The other aspect about getting the service organized was to get it registered with the government as a non-profit organization. That was very important because it affected our finances. So when we applied to get Meals on Wheels registered in 1964, We could not do so because the government said that the term Meals on Wheels was a generic term. It could be used freely by anybody. So then we decided that we would apply to the welfare organisation government to register Meals on Wheels as a care service for the aged, and that they agreed. Once we were established as Meals on Wheels for the care of the aged, or for the aged, it then could develop into what it is today. Much broader, much more practical, and much more effective. So we praise God for the way He has led in the development of the service. The other aspect is that there are hundreds of people today who serve as care givers who have not got the same denominational background as Seventh-day Adventists. So we need to have a code of ethics, which I believe is now being produced, whereby everybody who serves in the Meals on Wheels organization has a ethical context in which to work. And it's very important that everybody serving in Meals on Wheels will accept this before they render their service. So the spiritual aspect must be guaranteed, and we must never lose sight of it. So those were some of the difficulties that the organization experienced. The church must never lose sight of the fact that Meals on Wheels was of divine origin. God had a purpose, because we are told that the mission of the church would never be accomplished until it has reached all sections of society. For us to concentrate on one or the other aspects of the mission of the church and neglect the social well-being of society would be a catastrophe. And so I hope that Meals on Wheels administration will keep the ship sailing with the sails set and constantly adjusted in order to be doing God's will and not man's will. But I just want to say in closing that that was one of the great challenges of my life, and I thank the Lord for having chosen me as His servant to introduce this service from its infancy. And I praise His name. Thank you.